This happened on New Year's Eve back in 2017. I remember it so vividly because it felt like the universe was intent on turning a festive evening into something straight out of a horror movie. I'm from Ohio, just outside Cleveland, and at the time I was flying home after wrapping up a semester at the University of Rochester. For personal reasons, I had to stay at school a week longer than most students, which meant spending Christmas by myself, lonely, cold, and unceremoniously quiet. It wasn't the holiday I had envisioned. The flight home itself was uneventful, but my mood was already sour before I even stepped on the plane. You see, I'm a die-hard Cleveland Browns fan, born into it really. And as I sat in the terminal, scrolling through updates, I watched in disbelief as the Browns lost their final game of the regular season. They became the second team in NFL history to go 0-16, completely winless. It was the kind of defeat that cuts deep, especially for someone who'd grown up rooting for them through thick and thin. As if that wasn't enough, my flight ended up being delayed. What was supposed to be a straightforward evening turned into a logistical mess. Originally, my family had planned for us to head to my cousin's house together for a New Year's Eve party, but the delay threw all of that out the window. My parents decided to leave early in our main car, leaving me to take the backup, a clunky old sedan. My mom, sensing my frustration, tried to make it up to me by leaving our golden retriever Vera behind to keep me company. By the time my Uber dropped me off at home, it was already close to 10 p.m. Without even unpacking, I hurriedly loaded my things into the spare car, grabbed Vera, and set off into the night. The drive was supposed to take about an hour and a half, mostly winding through empty Ohio back roads flanked by sprawling fields and patches of forest. The night was quiet, with only the occasional farmhouse breaking the darkness. There wasn't much snow on the ground, just a light dusting that shimmered under my headlights. Still, the isolation was palpable. It was one of those nights where the world feels unnervingly still, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. About halfway through the drive, Vera started whining in the passenger seat. At first, I thought she just wanted attention, but when she stood up and started pacing, I realized she needed a bathroom break. Reluctantly, I pulled over at a small clearing on the side of the road. It was barely big enough for the car, but it would have to do. The cold hit me like a wall as I stepped out. I let Vera out without her leash, trusting she wouldn't wander too far. She sniffed around near the edge of the trees, seemingly unbothered by the darkness. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake how eerie it felt. The woods were so dark that if it weren't for the patches of snow, I wouldn't have been able to see anything beyond the first few trees, seemingly unbothered by the darkness. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake how eerie it felt. The woods were so dark that if it weren't for the patches of snow, I wouldn't have been able to see anything beyond the first few trees. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it, a loud crashing sound echoing from deep within the wind. It wasn't the kind of noise you could dismiss as a branch breaking in the wind. I knew, as soon as I heard it, I wouldn't see it build up again. It was deliberate and heavy, like someone or something was moving through the trees with purpose. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Before I could react, Vera bolted straight into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. My stomach dropped. I called her name over and over, my voice trembling with panic. She didn't come back. Without thinking, I ran after her, my phone flashlight barely cutting through the thick darkness. The cold air stung my lungs, and every step felt like I was plunging deeper into the unknown. The crashing sound continued, now seemingly closer, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back. But leaving Vera out there wasn't an option. After what felt like an eternity, I finally spotted her. She was crouched low, her tail tucked between her legs, trembling as she slowly made her way back toward me. I dropped to my knees, relief washing over me as I pulled her close. But something wasn't right. Her terror was palpable, and it only made me more aware of the danger we were still in. Grabbing her collar, I tried to retrace my steps back to the car, but the woods felt disorienting, like a maze designed to keep me lost. Then the crashing sound resumed, this time much closer, and undeniably following us. I didn't think, I just ran, Vera darting ahead of me as if she knew the way. The sound of breaking branches and crunching snow seemed to chase us, growing louder with every step. By some miracle, Vera led us straight back to the car. I threw her inside and scrambled into the driver's seat. Before driving off, I glanced back toward the woods, and that's when I saw them. 3 figures standing at the edge of the trees, motionless and watching. My stomach twisted into knots as I jammed the keys into the ignition and floored it out of there. It wasn't until I was several miles away that I noticed Vera was bleeding, a thin cut just below her shoulder blade. Someone, or something, had gotten to her. That night still haunts me. The figures, the sounds, the sheer terror of it all. I've never felt so vulnerable in my life. Even now, I can't drive those back roads without feeling like I'm being watched. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more chilling tales like it, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next. It was New Year's Eve in 2017, a night that should have been filled with excitement and anticipation. Instead, it turned out to be a whirlwind of frustration and loneliness. My name is Chris, and I'm from a small town in Ohio, just outside Akron. I was on my way home after wrapping up a semester at the University of Buffalo. It wasn't exactly the holiday I had envisioned. Due to some personal commitments, I had to stay back at school for a week after the semester officially ended. That meant spending Christmas away from my family and friends, a reality that felt heavier than I expected. The campus was eerily quiet, and while I managed to keep myself busy, it didn't stop the loneliness from creeping in. By the time I was finally on my way home, my mood was already in the dumps. The flight itself wasn't bad, but everything leading up to it felt like a punch in the gut. To add to my misery, as I waited at the airport, I watched my hometown football team, the Titans, lose their last game of the regular season. Not just any loss, though. They'd gone completely winless for the season. 0 victories. A perfect storm of disappointment for a lifelong fan like me. I think they were the first team in decades to hit that rock bottom. The final whistle blew, and with it, so did my patience for the day. Things only got worse from there. My flight was delayed, throwing my family's New Year's plans completely off track. We were supposed to head to my cousin's house together for a big celebration, staying overnight to ring in the new year as a family. But because of my late arrival, my parents decided to leave without me, taking the family car. There I was, stranded at the airport, waiting for a plane that seemed like it would never arrive. The cold winter winds outside mirrored my mood perfectly. Little did I know, this night wasn't just about delays and football losses. It was about to take a turn into something I couldn't have imagined. I was stuck driving the spare car alone. My mom, trying to make up for my earlier disappointment, had left Vera, our golden retriever, behind to keep me company. I wasn't thrilled about the solo trip, but Vera was always a solid companion. She'd be a welcome distraction during the long drive. I figured I'd make the most of it. By the time my Uber dropped me off at the house, it was well past 10 p.m. I didn't have the energy to unpack, so I just shoved all my things into the back seat, locked up the house, and hit the road. The drive ahead wasn't anything to write home about. Just miles and miles of Ohio back roads, winding through fields and patches of sparse woods. The landscape was mostly flat, with barely a car on the road. There wasn't much snow on the ground, just a light dusting, which I considered a blessing. I hated driving in snow, especially after the Browns game and the airport mess. But what bothered me the most was the complete darkness. The only light was the sharp beam of my headlights cutting through the pitch-black night, and the occasional farmhouse in the distance, its porch light glowing like a tiny island in an ocean of nothingness. About halfway through the trip, Vera started to whine. At first, I thought she just wanted attention, but soon she was pacing back and forth in the passenger seat, her ears alert. That's when it hit me. She needed to go to the bathroom. I groaned inwardly. There wasn't much else I could do but pull over into the next clearing and give her a moment. I eased the car to the side of the road, the tires crunching softly over the thin layer of snow. As soon as I stopped, Vera was up and out of the car in an instant, running off into the dark. I leaned against the side of the car, watching her with one eye as I checked my phone. The night felt still, too still, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The woods surrounding me were eerily quiet, not even the usual rustling of animals in the trees. A few minutes passed, and I called out softly for Vera. No response. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my face. "Vera?" I called again, this time with a little more urgency. Still, nothing. I made my way cautiously toward the tree line, the faint glow of the car's headlights casting long, exaggerated shadows across the empty road. The world around me felt unnaturally quiet, as if it were holding its breath. My eyes darted around the surrounding darkness. That's when I heard it. A soft rustling in the bushes behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just more empty space, just the haunting silence. "Vera!" I shouted again, a sense of unease creeping up my spine. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her swing down her eyes like a flash of gold in the darkness, darting out from behind the trees. I felt a small wave of relief, but then she stopped. Vera froze, her body stiff, her head turned toward the woods. Her fur was standing on end, and her tail was tucked between her legs. She was looking at something I couldn't see. I took a hesitant step forward. "Vera, come on." She didn't move. Instead, she started growling, a deep, low sound that sent a chill down my spine. "What is it, girl?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. But Vera wouldn't take her eyes off whatever was lurking in the trees. My stomach twisted in knots. Something wasn't right. I reached out slowly, trying to calm her. But the moment my hand touched her fur, she broke into a full sprint, rushing back to the car, her growl escalating into frantic barking. Confused and unsettled, I turned to look at the woods. Nothing. But the air felt thicker. Now, heavier. And it was then that I realized I wasn't alone. I didn't think, just acted. Without a second thought, I bolted into the woods, yelling for Vera to come back. I didn't want to even consider what she was chasing, but the fear of losing her overwhelmed me. I just ran, letting the adrenaline drive me forward. The only sources of light were the dim glow of my phone's flashlight and the faint dusting of snow beneath my feet, which barely illuminated the path ahead. It was so dark that I was practically colliding with tree trunks, my movements reckless in my desperation. Each breath was sharp and cold, biting at my lungs. I barely noticed how much time was passing. My focus was on finding Vera, on reaching her before whatever she was so fixated on found her first. I pushed forward, the cold air stinging my throat, but my legs were starting to feel like lead. The snow beneath my boots crunched in the silence, but the woods around me felt dead quiet. I couldn't hear a thing except for the sound of my own labored breathing, and I was starting to lose hope. What if I couldn't find her? My heart pounded in my chest as my body began to protest, the cold making every muscle ache. Tried to steady myself, but after running with everything I had, I could feel my strength draining fast. My legs buckled beneath me, and I stumbled, nearly falling to the ground from sheer exhaustion. I stopped, gasping for air, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking from the cold, and I knew I couldn't keep this up for much longer. The woods felt endless, and the darkness pressed in on all sides. I clutched my phone tighter, hoping the faint light would help me see something, anything that could lead me back to Vera. But all I could hear was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, and the faintest, most unsettling noise, the crack of something moving in the distance. Something big. I leaned heavily against a tree, my body shaking, and for a moment I thought I might completely break down. I had no idea what to do next. Everything felt like it was slipping out of my control. And then, through the darkness, I saw her. Vera was crouched low, her body trembling, moving toward me slowly, Her tail was tucked so tightly between her legs that I almost didn't recognize her. I had never seen her this frightened. Without thinking, I dropped to my knees, pulling her close, relief washing over me as I felt her press against me. But she was shaking uncontrollably, her body a tight ball of fear. Something had scared her, and the realization hit me like a punch in the gut. Panic started to settle in again. We were still deep in the woods, and whatever had scared Vera was still out there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew I had to act fast. I pulled myself to my feet, telling Vera to stay close. This time, she obeyed, sticking right by my side, as if she knew her survival depended on it. We started to make our way back to the car, but I had no idea if I was heading in the right direction. Every shadow seemed menacing, and the silence around us felt too heavy. Then, I heard it. The sound of crashing branches behind us. Without a second thought, I took off running, barely able to keep my balance. Vera was ahead of me, darting through the darkness with a speed I didn't know she had. I followed, praying I wouldn't trip and fall. But the crashing noise kept coming, louder this time, as if something or someone was chasing us. The fear that gripped me in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, my chest tightening as if the air itself had thickened. I had no idea what was out there, but I knew it wasn't something I could outrun on my own. By some miracle, Vera led me straight back to the car. My legs were like jelly as I rushed to the passenger side, practically throwing Vera inside before slamming the door shut behind her. I jumped into the driver's seat and locked the doors, my hands trembling so badly that I could barely grip the steering wheel. Before I even started the engine, I glanced back toward the woods, and the sight made my stomach lurch. There, standing at the edge of the forest, were 3 figures, their forms barely visible in the shadows, just watching us. My blood ran cold. Without hesitation, I jammed the keys into the ignition and floored it, not daring to look back again. I didn't slow down. The fear had a hold of me so tightly that I didn't care about anything except getting as far away from that place as possible. It wasn't until I had driven a few miles down the road that I noticed something was wrong. Vera was lying in the back seat, her fur matted with something dark and sticky. My stomach twisted when I realized she was bleeding. Your name. Panic surged through me as I looked down at Vera. There, just beneath her shoulder blade, was a deep, ragged cut. Someone had stabbed her. My heart dropped, and I slammed the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. Without thinking, I bolted out of the car, rushing to the trunk. Thank goodness for my mom's obsession with being prepared. She always kept a first aid kit in every car, and for once, her over-preparedness was exactly what I needed. I grabbed the kit and quickly got to work, cleaning Vera's wound as gently as I could, though she whimpered in pain. It made my stomach twist, but I knew I had to do this. I wrapped the cut in gauze, my hands shaking as I tried to stay calm. In that moment, after everything that had happened, I could finally breathe. It was over. At least, I hoped it was. For the first time since everything started, I felt a bit of relief wash over me. I tried not to think about what had just occurred, but the shock of it all lingered. My mind couldn't stop replaying the terror of the night. The drive after that was a blur. I didn't speak to Vera. I didn't speak to anyone. I just focused on the road, barely able to keep my thoughts straight. I didn't tell my parents or relatives what had happened that night. For some reason, I kept it to myself. Maybe it was too much to explain, or maybe it felt too unreal. I don't know. But it was something I couldn't shake. What I'm about to share with you is something that still haunts me, especially around this time of year. That night on New Year's Eve is something that lingers in my mind. Even though it's been years since it happened, I can't seem to forget it. And sometimes, I wonder if I ever will. I was on my way to my parents' house to ring in the new year with them. They live a few hours away in upstate Pennsylvania, so I had planned to leave in the late afternoon, thinking I'd arrive with plenty of time to spare. The drive was supposed to be a simple, easy one. I'm the type who enjoys long drives, and I figured it would be the perfect opportunity to clear my head. But of course, the weather had other plans, and they saw it in my eyes when I never took my gaze away. About an hour into my drive, the snow began to fall. At first, it was just light flurries, nothing to worry about, just a soft dusting on the windshield. I thought it was actually kind of beautiful. But as luck would have it, I jinked myself. The further I drove, the heavier the snow became. It fell faster, thicker, until I found myself smack in the middle of a full-blown blizzard. The highway grew slick and treacherous. Visibility was practically non-existent, and my little sedan, which wasn't exactly made for snowstorms, started slipping on even the smallest inclines. At that point, I knew I couldn't keep going. It wasn't worth risking my life for a few more miles. I found a spot on the shoulder, far enough off the road to avoid any passing cars. Not that there were many. Traffic had thinned out significantly. I texted my parents, letting them know I was stuck. They were understandably worried, and while I reassured them that I was fine, I wasn't completely confident about that myself. I figured I'd wait out the storm, hoping it would ease up. But the snow didn't let up at all. If anything, it only got worse. It piled up quickly, covering the car and the road ahead, until it was clear I wasn't going anywhere that night. After about an hour of sitting there, I received a message from my dad, offering to come out and get me. I quickly texted him back, telling him that trying to make the trip in this weather was a death wish. I told my dad that if the snow didn't let up soon, I'd have no choice but to call the police for assistance. He reluctantly agreed, understanding that it was the best option at that point. I didn't want to go that route, though. I didn't have AAA, and the last thing I wanted was to involve the authorities. I convinced myself that the storm would eventually pass, and if it didn't by the time I grew too tired to keep waiting, I'd make the call. Spending the night in the car wasn't something I was keen on. The thought of running out of gas trying to keep warm, and the possibility of draining the battery if I kept the lights or heat on too long had me anxious. So I tried to ration the use of my car's engine, turning it on and off at intervals to conserve as much power as possible. The wind howled outside, adding to the sense of isolation. It was starting to get to me when, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement in my rearview mirror. Through the thick snow, headlights pierced the darkness, moving steadily toward me. At first I thought it was just another car, maybe another driver who had pulled over. But as the figure drew closer, I realized there was something strange about the way the vehicle was maneuvering. It wasn't the typical swerving of a car struggling with a snowstorm. It was deliberate, almost too precise. My heart skipped a beat. Was someone else stranded? Or was something else going on? I felt an overwhelming sense of relief when I saw it, a snowplow pulling up alongside me. Finally, help had arrived. I quickly rolled down the window, my heart racing in anticipation. The driver leaned out from his seat, an older man, likely in his late 50s. He appeared friendly enough, dressed in a heavy jacket with a black knit hat pulled snugly over his ears. I remember his face stood out. It was deeply weathered, etched with lines as though years of harsh winters had left their mark. I had expected him to speak right away, but instead, he just stared at me for a long moment. It felt unusual, almost unnerving. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally spoke, asking if I was okay. His voice was rough and gravelly, the kind that suggested years of smoking. There was something about it that made me uneasy, but I tried not to let it show. "I don't think my car can handle this weather," I told him, trying to sound calm and friendly, even though I was far from it. He nodded slowly, agreeing that in conditions like these, I wasn't going to get far in my car. He looked me over for a moment, as though mulling something over in his mind. His gaze shifted to the back seat of my car, scanning it as if looking for something. Or maybe someone. It was strange, but I pushed the thought aside. Before I could respond, he offered me a ride. I froze for a second, unsure. I didn't know this man, and something about him still felt off, but he seemed sincere enough. Besides, staying put in the storm all night seemed like a terrible idea. A ride with a stranger was risky, but the alternative was worse. After a moment of hesitation, I agreed. I cautiously asked him if he could take me to my destination, and he assured me it wouldn't be an issue. I then inquired about what I should do with my car. He merely shrugged, saying I should leave it. After a brief moment of hesitation, I agreed. I grabbed my bag and climbed into the cab of the snowplow. The warmth inside the vehicle immediately put me at ease, and I could feel the tension in my body begin to melt away as I settled into the seat. The driver asked where I was headed, and I explained that I was on my way to my parents' house. I gave him the directions, and he nodded but didn't say much else. At first, the quiet seemed normal, but as the minutes ticked by, I began to feel a strange unease growing within me. That's when I noticed something strange. He wasn't driving toward my parents' house. I glanced at the GPS, and it was clear the direction we were heading was completely wrong. We were on a local highway, and I knew that there were only two main routes. I tried to stay calm, but my voice betrayed me as I asked, "Are we going the right way?" He didn't even look at me as he answered, his voice a little colder. He said we were taking a short detour and that the back roads would be better than staying on the highway. I didn't know the area well enough to question him, but something about the way he spoke made my stomach churn. Sure enough, he exited the highway, veering off onto a winding back road. The GPS still indicated we were headed in the right direction, but a nagging feeling in my gut told me something wasn't quite right. I tried to convince myself I was just overthinking it. My gut, however, kept telling me something was wrong. I started scanning the cab more closely, trying to gather any clues that could explain my growing anxiety. That's when I saw the warning signs. Empty liquor bottles rolled around the floor by his feet, their presence unsettling. Torn-up maps were stuffed into the side pockets, their edges frayed as if hastily shoved in. And then my eyes fell on a knife wedged between the seats, its blade glinting in the dim light. My heart began to race, the kind of pounding that makes you feel like everyone can hear it. My breath quickened, and a surge of panic shot through me. I was sure now we weren't headed in the right direction. The GPS kept recalibrating as he missed one turn after another, without a second glance at the screen. I couldn't sit idly by anymore. As the minutes dragged on, I spotted a house in the distance. It was the only sign of civilization for miles, and it felt like a lifeline. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding harder with each passing second, and waited until we were closer. In that moment of desperation, I grabbed the door handle, kicked it open as hard as I could, and launched myself into the cold, biting air. The impact of hitting the ground made my leg flare up with pain, but I barely registered it. I scrambled to my feet and began running toward the house, slipping slightly in the snow but pushing forward with everything I had. Behind me, I heard the man shout something, and when I glanced back, I saw him fumbling through the glove box, likely reaching for a weapon. That sight propelled me forward, and I didn't look back again. I sprinted as fast as I could, praying I wouldn't slip and fall. When I finally reached the house, I pounded on the door, shouting for help. A man and woman answered, and without hesitation, they pulled me inside. I collapsed to the floor, breathless and terrified. I quickly told them everything that had happened, and they didn't ask questions. They just called the police. When the officers arrived, the snowplow was gone. They promised to keep an eye out and search the area, but with the storm raging on, finding him seemed nearly impossible. They offered to give me a ride to my parents' house and even helped arrange for my car to be towed. I was overwhelmed with gratitude. When my dad found out, he was furious, but I was just relieved to be safe. Since that night, I haven't driven in the snow again. I always think about how different things could have turned out if I hadn't taken that chance to jump out of the truck when I did. It still haunts me. A few years ago, I found myself once again headed out to the icy wilderness of northwestern Ontario to continue a tradition that had been passed down from my dad. Ever since I was a kid, he and his buddies would head out ice fishing on New Year's Eve, while the rest of the world was out celebrating. It wasn't that we had much family, my mom wasn't around, and my dad's side of the family wasn't close, so my New Year's Eves were spent on a frozen lake, braving the bitter cold, alongside my dad, his brother, my own brother, and a few of my dad's friends. Things have changed since then. My dad's no longer with us, and my brother moved to Chicago years ago, but I still try to keep the tradition alive, mostly as a way to honor the memories we made. I'm not entirely sure why, but there's something about it that feels necessary. Maybe it's a way to stay connected to the past. For the last few years, my two best friends, Nate and Trevor, have joined me. They're rugged, no-nonsense guys who fit the stereotypical lumberjack look. Bearded, tough, and far more at home in the woods than in any city. To be honest, that's exactly how I see myself too. This year, it was Nate's turn behind the wheel. His truck is perfect for these kinds of trips. Big tires, four-wheel drive, and enough room in the back to fit everything we'd need for the day. Fishing rods, bait, tip-ups, and a sled to haul it all. We even had a pop-up shelter to keep the wind at bay. The forecast had promised clear skies, but anyone who knows the Ontario wilderness knows better than to rely too much on weather predictions. We were ready for anything, or so we thought. The lake we were heading to wasn't exactly well known, and that's exactly why we loved it. It was tucked away, surrounded by thick forests, and its surface stayed solid even during the warmer spells of winter. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find unless you knew exactly where to go. As Nate steered his truck down the snowy back roads, the excitement in the air was palpable, and the sense of tradition grew stronger with each passing mile. But little did we know, this year would be different. What was supposed to be just another quiet, peaceful New Year's Eve of ice fishing would soon take a turn. There's something uniquely peaceful about ice fishing. The stillness, the simplicity of just you, your friends, and the possibility of a good catch. It's a far cry from spending New Year's Eve drinking beer at some noisy bar. As we pulled up to park near the trailhead, I noticed someone standing a few yards away. He was bundled in heavy winter gear, but something about him didn't sit right. He wasn't moving, just staring at our truck. At first, I thought maybe he was another fisherman, possibly checking us out. But then I saw him glance down at his phone, then back at us, then back at the screen. It didn't feel like a casual glance. There was something unsettling about the whole thing. I muttered to Nate and Trevor, telling them the guy was creeping me out. Trevor just shrugged it off, and Nate nodded but didn't say much. We were getting ready to unload when the man suddenly rushed toward us, waving his arms frantically. I rolled down the window, wondering what the heck was going on. He was yelling that we needed to come help him right away, saying his buddy had fallen through the ice. He pointed to his phone, showing us a message that his friend was in trouble, his voice full of panic. The desperation in his voice seemed genuine, but something about the urgency of it all made me feel uneasy. Trevor swung open his door and we all hurried out, following the man as he sprinted down the trail toward the lake. We didn't stop to grab anything, no coats, no gear. The urgency in his voice left no room for hesitation. The man was practically running, and we had to jog to keep up. As we got closer to the lake, something started to feel off. He wasn't leading us to the usual fishing spots. Instead, we were heading toward a more remote part of the shoreline, far from where the ice was thickest. I was just about to question our path when I spotted two more figures standing near the lake's edge. They weren't dressed for fishing, and they weren't moving. They just stood there, watching us. I glanced down and saw that they both had rifles. My stomach dropped. One of them shouted for us to stop as we approached, raising his gun and pointing it straight at me. I can't fully explain the cold wave of fear that rushed over me. I hope no one ever has to feel that kind of panic. The man we'd been following turned to face us, a smirk creeping across his face. We'd been set up from the start. The second guy demanded Nate's keys and everything else we had. We didn't have much of a choice. These men were serious, and they weren't playing games. Nate reached into his pocket and tossed the keys to the man. The three of us emptied our pockets, and I tried to hold on to my phone, but one of them told me to hand it over. When Nate mentioned his phone was still in the car, they just laughed. I could feel the fury boiling inside me. How could we have been so naive? I clenched my fists, wishing I could do something, anything. But with them armed and in control, it was clear we had no chance. They took everything from us and started walking us back up the trail. We were forced to walk back up the trail at gunpoint, and just as one of the men sped off in Nate's truck, the other two backed into the woods, probably heading to their own vehicle. I briefly thought about following them, but I realized it wouldn't do any good. We stood there for a moment, shivering in the cold. Before Nate pulled out his phone, I knew he had lied about leaving it in the car, but I couldn't help feeling grateful that he had it with him. Somehow, we still had service. He called the police, quickly explaining the situation as best he could. The dispatcher told us to stay put, and we huddled together, trying to conserve warmth as we waited for help. I was still fuming. Nate, though, was beside himself, kicking nearby trees and swearing at the top of his lungs. Trevor and I couldn't do anything to calm him down. It had all happened so fast. I was still processing everything. Why would anyone be out in the middle of nowhere on New Year's Eve, of all days? It didn't make sense. Skipping the more tedious parts, the police arrived, took our report, and were kind enough to drive us to Trevor's place, which was the closest. As expected, Nate's truck was never found, and the men who robbed us were never caught. The three of us still can't wrap our heads around it. Trevor thinks we just ran into the wrong people at the wrong time, that they weren't planning on robbing us, but we ended up being the perfect targets. I could see that as a possibility, but it still feels too improbable. Who just springs a trap on random strangers without any planning? Besides, why would they be waiting at such a remote spot, with no guarantee anyone would even show up? Honestly, I don't know what to make of it all. It's just one of those things that'll stick with me forever. And that's the end of this wild and unbelievable experience. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened, but one thing's for sure. Life can throw some unexpected challenges our way. I hope this story gave you a little perspective on the strange and unpredictable moments that can catch us off guard. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more stories like this, or if you just want to support the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and with your help, we'll be able to bring even more unique content your way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.